As you heard, my name's Chad Lewis. I'll be your presenter this evening. And although my background is actually in the field of psychology, for the last 25 years, I've been traveling the world in search of the strange and unusual. Everything from hunting for vampires in Transylvania, looking for the Loch Ness Monster, crop circles, UFOs, reports of abductions, really odd people, weird places, you name it. If it's just strange and a little offbeat, I've traveled around the globe in search of these anomalies. But what I discovered is that sometimes the weirdest things happen right in your own backyard. So that's what we're going to talk about this evening. The bizarre history of Minnesota. For the next 45, 50 minutes or so, we'll take a tour through the history of the state to some of the weirdest and most bizarre stories that you may have never heard about. Of course, if you listen to the rest of the country, they all believe that Minnesota's weird in its own right, but for other reasons. The rest of the country thinks everyone in Minnesota lives in the Twin Cities, that you're all crazy Viking fans, that Fargo is actually in Minnesota, everyone has a cabin up north, and everyone is nice. And although this last one may be true, I'm going to be talking about a different Minnesota, a weirder, more bizarre, and in some aspects, a more fascinating legend of the state. So with that, what exactly are we going to be exploring this evening? Well, we're going to be looking at everything from bizarre deaths and ghosts down to weird people, psychic phenomena, and UFOs. And I've thrown in what I also call keep in minds, things about the state you just might not have known. For instance, the time period in which we're going to talk about tonight, there were only about 430,000 people in the state. Today, there's over 5.5 million in the state, meaning back then, they had a lot more room to spread out and be weird. And believe me, they took full advantage of that space. And I really want tonight's program to be a time portal back to the odd days. Most of these stories come from the late 1800s, early 1900s. So with that, let's begin our journey to the weirdest history Minnesota has to offer. First category, bizarre deaths. Today, if you open up your newspaper and flip to the obituary section, you'll probably find stories like this. Old man Lewis died peacefully, surrounded by his loving family. No details, no cause of death is listed, nothing outside that it was a smooth transition into the afterlife. But in the era in which I was searching, I was finding different types of obituaries because I was finding stories like this. Suicide is gruesome, whole top of his head blown off by the blast. Quite a bit different than dying peacefully surrounded by your loving family. And it got me interested in why people of that era were more fascinated by death than we are today. It also got me interested in how newspapers like to put good headlines to sell more papers around deaths, which is why you got stories like this one out of Albert Lee, where a man kills himself because he's homely. It talks about a man who was courting a girl, and when he went to the theater, he saw she was there with another suitor and that she rejected him. And for theatrical effect, he grabbed his pistol, put it to his heart, of course, and shot and killed himself, the bullet breaking his heart like she did. But when you hear of these old cases of people dying at a young age, don't feel too bad, because the average life expectancy in 1900 was only 47 years of age. So when these people died young, they weren't missing out on a lot of life expectancy. And today we love getting afraid, getting scared, whether it's in a movie theater or by going to amusement parks. So let me just mute everyone here. There we go. To amusement parks, we love getting scared. But in the old days, being frightened could cause you your death. Exactly what happened to this next gentleman who was the postmaster. They were auditing his accounts and he came up short. And rather than find the discrepancy, he died on the spot from fright of being found out that maybe he was embezzling. Other deaths were simple mysteries that they couldn't figure out at first, like this case out of Stillwater. Talks about a woman being found dead in her house. It was thought to be a suicide, but then they figured out that she had a cat, and the cat was in a lot of pain, was not doing well, was very old. So this woman looked to put her cat out of its suffering, grabbed the chloroform, and tried to end the cat's life. But it took her so long, or maybe she knocked it over, the chloroform spread through the house, ended up killing her and the cat. So it was not a case of a suicide. But as much as people feared dying in those days, people also feared being buried alive. The terrible thought of waking up 6 feet under. And it's a great urban legend. It's a great piece of folklore. But was anyone ever buried alive? Well, yes, we know thousands of people were buried alive. We know this because we have thousands of newspaper accounts from the late 1800s, early 1900s. Back then, whether you were in a diabetic shock or in a coma, doctors would often pronounce you dead. But lo and behold, many people, some of which were even at their own funeral, would pop up just in the nick of time to be saved from being buried alive. Now, today, this may seem a little silly to us with modern medicine and science, but our great-grandparents were so frightened of being buried alive, they came up with several inventions, including a spring-loaded coffin that had a lever on the inside. If you were buried alive, you could pull that lever and it would spring the top of your casket up. I don't know how well it worked with 6 feet of dirt on top of it, but they did sell quite a few of these. But my favorite invention was this. It's called a cemetery bell, and it does or did exactly what it looks like it would do. It was a bell that you could have above your grave on a rope on a pole going down into your casket. So if you awoke in time and found yourself buried alive, all you'd have to do is tug this rope, it would ring the bell and alert the caretaker who lived at the cemetery that you had been buried alive and they could come and rescue you. But there was one problem with this invention, though. On many nights, the wind would set these bells off, giving the caretaker quite a scare, thinking everyone had been buried alive. It was actually your responsibility after your loved one died to sit around their grave for several days and nights to ensure that they were truly dead, that they would not rise up from the grave and come back to the living. But I'm going to stop talking about bizarre deaths, not because I don't find them fascinating, I do, but because it's dangerous. I found dozens of cases where people were merely talking about death when they dropped dead, as though merely bringing up the idea of dying is enough to cause you your own death, which is why I'm going to move on to our next category while I still can. And that category is ghosts and hauntings. You can't throw a rock in Minnesota without hitting a place that is thought to have a haunted story attached to it. And if you're looking to go to one haunted place in Minnesota, I recommend you head down to Jackson, Minnesota, to a place called Loon Lake Cemetery. Actually, I recommend you don't go here because the locals, they don't call it Loon Lake Cemetery. They call it Witch Cemetery. The legend is many years ago in the 1800s, a young girl by the name of Mary Jane was practicing witchcraft, the dark arts. And the community, in order to stop her from bringing evil to the village, grabbed an axe, chopped off her head, and dumped her body and the bloody axe in a grave out at Loon Lake Cemetery. And if there's any cemetery that looks like it should be haunted, it's this one. It's in the middle of nowhere. You have to walk about a quarter mile on this makeshift trail, and eventually you'll come to the cemetery and discover that it's been heavily vandalized, neglected, and overrun. People who do venture out here have all kinds of odd paranormal activity. Weird balls of light, disembodied voices talking to them. But most go out there to see the witch's grave and to take the dare. The dare is that if you're brave enough or foolish enough to walk or jump or skip, hop over the grave of the witch, you'll be cursed with bad luck until the day you die. Every year I'd hear from a handful of people who claimed that when they did the dare, they were involved in a minor car accident. They broke up with their significant other. They lost their employment, mishap, misfortune, and death. So I had heard so many of these stories that when I first went there 20 years ago, I was very excited to take the dare. But the problem is we don't know which grave is the witch's. Many of the graves are unmarked, nearly half of them. Even the plat books do not list who is buried where. Mary Jane, that alleged witch, well, her gravestone sits down at the local historical society. They have it at their museum for safekeeping, thinking somebody would steal it. Since we don't know which grave is the witch's, and add in the fact that people claim there may be 3 witches buried out in the cemetery, my advice is to make sure you're careful walking by every gravestone so you do not curse and get cursed by the witch. But of course, not everyone believes there are witches out at the cemetery, which is why one of the first things you'll see when you get there is this sign saying no ghosts or witches exist in Loon Lake Cemetery. But you don't have to take their word for it. You don't have to take my word for it. You can take your own word for it, because right out in front of the graveyard is a small self-registering campground where you can spend the night on your own. The place is so rural and so secluded, you won't have to worry about anybody bothering you. At least not anyone who's alive, that is. Keep in mind, Minnesota is the home of Spam. And if you haven't been to the wonderful new Spam Museum in Austin, you can go and check it out and see whatever the heck Spam is. I love medical anomalies. This is a category where today we could probably explain some of these scenarios. But back then, they had no idea what was going on. Now, a lot of you watching this evening are probably coffee drinkers. You enjoy a good cup or a couple cups a day. But this next lady, I think she has you beat, because she enjoyed coffee so much that it was said it drove her insane because she drank 20 quarts of coffee every single day. They eventually committed her to the insane asylum, where they took her off of coffee thinking that would cure her insanity. But in fact, it had the opposite effect. She went more insane, to the fact that she never got out of the insane asylum. They blamed it on coffee making her insane. But next time someone tells you to cut back on coffee, you may want to say it's for your mental health that you have a few cups a day. Keep in mind, Tonka trucks were invented and developed in Minnesota as well, just one of the many inventions that you have in your state. This next story comes out of an Illinois paper, and they tried claiming that this young girl was from Galesburg, Illinois. She was 5 years old and said she had wool growing all over her body. Her face had that silky, fine 9-inch long hair like coming out of it. They called her the woolly girl. But like so much at that time, it was not quite accurate. She was known as the woolly girl, but she wasn't from Illinois. She was from the Twin Cities, Minnesota, and she wasn't a part wool and part girl. She was a well-known freak of nature, as they were called, a performer, Alice Elizabeth Doherty. She went on to have a good life as a freak of nature. And of course, she wasn't part sheep or any other part animal. She simply suffered from hypertrichosis, a genetic disorder that those afflicted with it usually grow hair on their upper torso and the face and the neck area. Usually, like Miss Doherty, these people would be put on display back then as freaks of nature, or freaks as they were known. If they were lucky, their parents would allow them to run off with the circus with people like P.T. Barnum of Barnum and Bailey's Ringling Brothers Circus, and later Robert Ripley of Ripley's Believe It or Not fame. And believe it or not, many of the parents allowed their children to run off with these men and the circus because they would make a lot of money doing it, and they'd have a much better life on the road than they would back on the farm in Minnesota. At one point in time, P.T. Barnum and one of his freaks of nature, General Tom Thumb, were two of the wealthiest men in America. I love this category because this is the category that science says these things do not exist. Skeptics claim that they can't exist, yet every year, hundreds and hundreds of people in Minnesota were coming face to face with these monsters. And this next legend I'm going to tell you about is one you might not want to know about. It is certainly one you don't want to say its name, because many cultures fear that merely saying the name of this next thing is enough to put you on its radar. That when you go looking for the weird will come looking for you. The creature I'm referring to is that of the winter cannibal called the Windigo, a giant monster of the north. Many believe the Windigo, in Minnesota at least, was a harbinger of death, that if you saw it, much like hearing or seeing the Irish banshee, it meant you or someone you knew was going to die very shortly. The Windigo started as a First Nation creature in Canada and soon spread to the Great Lakes region of the United States. It could either come as a flesh and blood monster and kill you, or it could possess you and slowly turn you into a Windigo as well. We have hundreds of cases of people killing one another because they were afraid one of their friends or loved ones was turning into a Windigo. And although we often associated it with Canada, there are several places in Minnesota that has a long history of Windigo sightings. Way up by the Canadian border is the small town of Ross, near Roseau and War Road. It's here, this location, that today there's not much there. But back in the old days, this place was called Indian Village, as you can see here, because several hundred native peoples lived there, along with several white pioneer families, one of which was Jake Nelson. Luckily for us, Jake kept a detailed journal about his life in the Roseau Valley. Most of it's pretty boring: fishing parties, hunting expeditions, the weather, mundane stuff. But he did write about two paranormal events up there, one of which is what he called the Will of the Wisp, this mysterious ball of light that would dance around the community, vanish, and then reappear in a matter of a second somewhere else. But Jake Nelson also reported Windigo sightings, several of them. Each and every time it was spotted, it was seen to be somewhere between 8 and 15 feet tall. always white-skinned, white-furred, or white-clothed when it appeared in the Ross area. And just as the legend feared, every time someone saw it, the very next day, an elder in the community passed away after experiencing this creature. Also, just east of Bemidji is Lake Windigo, where many believe the Windigo is in the lake, waiting for victims to walk around the shoreline, where it grabs them, pulls them under, and they meet their watery grave and never return. Out of all the creatures throughout history in North America, the Windigo put more fear in the hearts of people than any other creature that we know of. I'll leave it up to you whether you venture up to the Northwoods looking for the Windigo or stay in the safety of your own home. Keep in mind, during Prohibition, there were more gangsters living in Minnesota than nearly anywhere else in the world. Every big name gangster of the day made their way to Minnesota, whether it was George Bugs Moran, Al Capone, George Babyface Nelson, John Dillinger, Creepy Karpus, Ma Barker, you name it. If they were wanted, they hung out in Minnesota. Usually, thanks to the agreement they had in St. Paul that as long as they didn't commit the crime in St. Paul, they were free to stay there as long as they wanted. But they weren't the weirdest creatures roaming Minnesota. Imagine waking up, flipping through your newspaper, and finding a story about the devil moose that was running all over the area. And this mainly was up in the big woods, the Lake of the Woods area in northern Minnesota. And it was during the early 1900s where people kept complaining and terrified that they would see some strange Frankenstein-like monster of a moose, bigger than any known moose, but it seemed to have parts made up from numerous other animals. Several hunts were gathered and organized. Posses were put together to go look for this giant devil moose of the Northwoods. And as the reports continued to file in, no one could find this monster. For as large and terrifying as it was, it seemed to be magnificent at hiding in the brush. As of today, this creature has not been captured. Perhaps one of you might be the next to grab this strange monster. I love this category as well because these stories were so bizarre, they didn't fit into any known category. So I made a category all for themselves. And keep in mind, in Minnesota, you have more bike trails in your state than any other state in the union. Some magnificent biking trails throughout Minnesota. Now, a lot of you watching tonight are probably married. And without a doubt, you are happily married. But if some of you are not happily married, you may want to try what this next gentleman did, because he wasn't happily married either. So instead of sticking with his wife and leading an unhappy life, he married her mother. It's exactly right. In 1881, he divorced his wife and married his wife's mother, thus becoming his wife's stepfather in the time. According to the newspaper account, it was a wonderful decision, said it was the best decision he had ever made. Now, a lot of you are probably thinking this isn't quite the decision you'd make, but 1881 times were a little bit different. Many of you probably like getting to Duluth for a nice little vacation or a weekend away. Beware, Duluth has been known to be overrun by rats, at least in the 1800s. I have many stories of people complaining about all the rats that were all over Duluth, so much so that visitors would not want to go there. Now, I'm happy to say that I've been to Duluth many, many times. I've never seen the rats. I don't know if they're there, Part of me hopes that the rats are still there, regrouping, getting ready to terrorize the next set of visitors and tourists that head up there. But one can always hope. Keep in mind, the average height of an American male at the time I'm talking about was only 5 feet 6 inches. In fact, the largest man ever on record was that of Robert Wadlow of Alton, Illinois. He died while still growing. He was a wee bit short of being 9 feet tall when he died. They have a life-size statue of him in Alton, Illinois. You can see how gigantic he truly was. They also have one at the Ripley's Believe It or Not Auditorium in Wisconsin Dells. Keep in mind, Minnesota claims to be the birthplace of Paul Bunyan. But before you get too excited, so do the states of Wisconsin, Vermont, Maine, Michigan, and of course, the country of Canada. All of these states, including my home state of Wisconsin, claim to be the birthplace of Paul Bunyan as well. But as far as we know, the first oral tales of Paul Bunyan came from a lumber camp north of Tomahawk, Wisconsin in the mid-1800s. But the first written reports come from a story in the Duluth newspaper in 1904. So I guess both Wisconsin and Minnesota can claim birthrights to Paul Bunyan. But regardless, Minnesota has more Paul Bunyan related roadside attractions than any other state in the US as well, including from the birth of Paul Bunyan. When he was born, he was brought to his cradle, which is so big, 12 men can stand inside of it when you go visit his cradle. In Chisholm, they have Paul Bunyan's marble, a natural granite stone weighing 9,000 pounds that he used for his marble. And of course, most people have no idea how Paul met Babe the Blue Ox. Well, they were friends, and this surrounded in mystery how they met, because they met in Minnesota, if you believe the Minnesota version, during the winter of the blue snow. The reason there was blue snow is it was so terrible weather-wise that people were cursing up a blue streak so much that it turned all the snow blue. They actually recorded this winter as having 2 winters that season because of the deadly temperatures. It was so cold that winter. What's that? How cold was it? It was so cold that winter that fish grew fur to stay warm. It was so cold that winter. How cold was it? It was so cold that at night your words would freeze in the air. You'd have to wait until the sun came up and melted the words to hear what your friend was talking about. That's how cold it was when Paul found Babe in the snow. Babe had already turned blue, and like everything around Paul Bunyan, Paul took him in and he grew to an enormous size, and Paul and Babe have been making their way across the Midwest ever since. If you're in Minnesota and you enjoy your 10,000 plus lakes, you can thank Paul and Babe, because Paul and Babe's footprints made all of the lakes that you enjoy in your state. Now, if you think I'm just spinning a yarn here for you, telling campfire tales, you'd be wrong. Because if Paul and Babe did not make these lakes, why do some of the lakes have Paul's footprint on them? Like Lake Bemidji in Bemidji, Minnesota, where you can see is in the shape of Paul's footprint. And everyone knows Paul and Babe were avid outdoorsmen. In Rush City, they have Paul Bunyan's largest walleye, 2,000 pounds. Pequot Lakes, they have his fishing bobber. In Hackensack, Minnesota, they have his love interest. And many, many others around the state, all Paul Bunyan roadside attractions that you can visit. But Paul is a great indicator of how things have changed over the years. We'll get on to Paul here. Kelleher is where Paul's grave was said to be. But I think the idea that Paul Bunyan died is the biggest tall tale of them all. We all know that Paul and Babe continued to roam throughout the Northwoods even to this very day. But Paul Bunyan's one thing. What about a cursed movie? Now, how many of you have seen this multi-Oscar winning movie? Probably a few of you. But if you haven't seen this or the 10,000 sequels they've made of it, the premise is pretty simple. A serial killer who happens to dabble in voodoo is shot by the police. But before he dies, he's able to cast a spell to move his soul into a doll named Chucky. And once he gets in the doll, he comes to life and tries to harm and curse everybody who gets in his way. But we know these stories only happen in Hollywood, right? Well, Hollywood or Janesville, Minnesota. Here you have the infamous Janesville dollhouse. For decades, this creepy doll sat up in the window of the house. No one knew why it was there. Some say it was there because the daughter committed suicide, or the family killed their son, or vice versa. The owner who put the doll there did not tell anybody why the doll was there. But what we do know is that for decades, people were fearful of this house. They would go out of their way to avoid this home because every time they walked by, the doll would come to life and watch them as they walked by. Over the years, it became a tourist destination. People would actually go by, walk or bike or drive with the hopes that the statue, the doll, would come to life and watch them. The legend was that if the doll watched you and moved, you'd be cursed with bad luck into the day you died. But then the owner died and the doll went missing. People in Janesville panicked. They thought they'd wake up and find it in bed with them at night. But don't worry, they found the doll and they gave it a new home. And it's a perfect home, or it was a perfect home, because where else would you want to put a doll that could kill you? Where else should you put a doll that could take your life with a curse? Well, for that, the only place you'd want to put it would be at your town's local library. And that's exactly what they did. They put it up in the front window overlooking the town. Librarians told me they were amazed at how many people came from other parts of the region just to see the doll. But the locals, they hated it. Kids were too afraid to go into the library. Parents complained it was too creepy. So they got rid of the doll. They gave it back to the man who bought the estate of the home where it once was. I spoke with him and he told me he wants to place the doll back in Janesville somewhere, but people are just too terrified. Nobody will let him have it there. Hopefully, in the future, they'll find a place for their cursed doll. Don't worry, you're not going to find any of your neighbors or in-laws in this section. It's too long ago for any of them. But Minnesota has a long and interesting history of unique and bizarre people in your state. Keep in mind, water skiing was invented in Lake City in 1922 by Ralph Samuelson. Some say he invented it to get away from Pepe, the lake monster of Lake Pepin, which now has a $50,000 reward attached to it if you can capture this lake monster that's been spotted for hundreds of years in Lake Pepin. Today, we're all familiar with the Me Too movement. We're all quite familiar with it. But you good people of Minnesota, you were way ahead of the curve because you had the Me Too movement back in the 1800s. Here's a case out of 1868 that talked about a man who kept harassing his friend's wife so much that he tried to kiss her, confessed his love to her over and over and over. So much it got to be so much trouble and harassment, they finally went to court. He was found guilty and fined $25 and court costs for trying to kiss his friend's wife. Quite a sum of money back in 1868. I think the man could have saved himself a lot of trial and a lot of money if he simply would have just married her mother instead, like the previous gentleman did. Keep in mind, Minnesota, you have nearly 12,000 lakes, even though you're known as the land of 10,000 lakes. This gentleman was pretty interesting, Francis Johnson. He was a farmer, and one day he was bored baling hay. He started to wrap some of the twine into a little ball. He wrapped it, and eventually that little ball wasn't so little anymore. He didn't stop until 1979, and you can see the size and weight of his ball of twine, in Darwin becoming the world's largest ball of twine. But I should clarify, it is the world's largest ball of twine done by one person. Believe it or not, there are several bigger balls of twine, but those were community events with multiple people joining in to make them so gigantic. So in Darwin, you can still see the world's largest ball of twine by one man. Psychic phenomena. Today, a lot of people are skeptics of psychic phenomena, but in the old days, it was seen as a means of entertainment. You had people like this going all over the Midwest and throughout the country, spreading stories of their psychic power, seances, ESP, telepathy, out-of-body experiences. And it was considered a great entertainment value to go to the theater and watch one of these psychics or intuitives work throughout the crowd, oftentimes to sold out crowds and glowing responses and reviews from the general public. But sometimes psychic power is a little odd, such as the case of the Winona vampire or death siren. It happened back in the 1920s in Winona, when this young girl, Mrs. Block, passed away. She was unfortunately one of many of the Block family that were dying. They were all buried out at St. Mary's Cemetery on the outskirts of Winona, with her brothers dying a bizarre death, and then her father, who lived on the east end of Winona in a superstitious neighborhood in this house, started talking to a lot of his neighbors who told him that it was this daughter that was responsible for all the other deaths in his family. The reason being is that the legend was back then, the superstition was that the first child to die in a family acted like some sort of graveyard siren and enticed all of their siblings to join them in death. And that if you did not do something, every single one of your children would fall victim to this siren. So the father was told the only way he could stop his daughter from grabbing more of his children was to chop off her head after he dug her up and then bury the head separately or at the bottom of her feet. So that's what he did. He went out to the cemetery, dug up his daughter, but he must have got cold feet because he did not desecrate the body at all. But when the police found out, they had to follow up on the case. So they redug up her and her brother and realized he had not harmed the bodies at all. He had gotten cold feet and chickened out. The weird thing is that there were no charges filed against him. Apparently, in Winona in the 1920s, you could dig up as many bodies as you wanted as long as you didn't harm them. Many say weird things still happen in this cemetery to this very day. I've been to the cemetery many times, both day and night, and luckily this psychic vampire has never come after me. But then again, I bring my vampire hunting kit with me when I am there. Keep in mind, the furnace thermostat was developed in Minnesota. Again, one of their many inventions that your state has. But psychic phenomena didn't just apply to people, it applied to animals as well. Here's a story where it talks about a man bought a horse named Hoodoo. He got the horse very cheap. Now, at the time, hoodoo was a curse, a word of being cursed, like you're hoodooed, you're cursed. And the reason they called the horse Hoodoo is that it had kicked its previous owner in the head and killed him. So the new owner got it for very cheap, but then the horse started a fire and 29 animals were all cremated in the blaze where the horse lived up to its name of Hoodoo. The last category we're going to talk about this evening is that of unidentified flying objects, UFOs. If you listen to skeptics, they claim that the only reason people see UFOs, the only reason people believe in UFOs is because of Hollywood. TV shows like the X-Files and Unsolved Mysteries, movies like Men in Black and Independence Day, that's why people believe in UFOs, because Hollywood has trained us to. But what you'll see here in these next few stories is that people in Minnesota were seeing weird things in the sky long before Mulder and Scully were out there investigating. Including the story out of Duluth, 1897, talking about weird airships passing over Minnesota. Number of inhabitants spotted it. And the headline was what newspapers usually did in those days when people reported weird things. Liquor must be the result of it. And I put this slide on the bottom, the photo, not because it shows Duluth or a UFO, but it illustrates that people of that era, they spent more time outside than we do today. So it's only fitting that they would see more things in the sky than we do today as well. Not only were half of them involved in farming, today that's less than 1% of the population, but many times in the summer when they'd come home, they'd wait for their house to cool off outside. If it didn't, they'd just simply sleep out in the front yard. Just as a little experiment for the next week, mentally keep track of how long you spend staring at the night sky. And if you're like most people, especially in winter, it's probably not that long. But the 1897 date of this sighting is significant as well, because 1897 saw the largest flap of UFO sightings in America's history. Thousands of people in hundreds of Midwestern cities all spotted these airships flying over these weird balls of light. You could actually follow the progress of these UFOs by following the newspaper accounts as they move from one city to the next. Over the years, the stories continued on through the 40s, the 50s, and the 60s, leading more mystery. And keep in mind, the Kensington runestone was thought to be discovered back in 1898. If you believe that it's authentic, it seems to show that people were here long before, explorers were here long before we thought they were. Others believe it's nothing more than a bizarre hoax. But regardless, it illustrates that odd events take place in Minnesota. And although this case happened in 1965, I had to include it because it was just so weird. It's one of my favorite cases. You'll see why in just a minute. It happened when a young radio DJ was heading in to Long Prairie to go to work. That's when he passed a bend in the road, when all of a sudden in the middle of the road, he saw what appeared to be some 30 to 40 foot rocket ship looking spacecraft. Thinking that it was a UFO and believing that none of his friends would believe him, he thought he was just going to crash into it and knock it over so he would have proof. But as soon as he thought that, his car died out. Battery went dead, radio lights, everything off. So thinking as only a 19-year-old could, he walked out of his car and said, "I'll just go push it over. Then I'll have proof." When he got to the front of the car, an opening appeared on the craft and out got a bunch of little 6-inch oil can looking creatures. The witness froze where he was and said, "I'll just watch it from here." He watched as they seemed to be doing some maintenance on the underbelly of the craft. He had no idea, but other people were calling in with their reports of a UFO in the vicinity too. He said they didn't have any eyes or cameras, but he got the distinct feeling that they knew he was watching them. Just took a few minutes for them to do whatever they were doing. They got back in the craft and flew off. When he got back in his car, it started back up and he raced down to the police station. The reason I love this case is the media had a field day with it because they didn't report it as little oil can aliens everywhere. They reported it as him seeing 6-inch beer can aliens. I always joke only in Minnesota would you get beer can aliens. So he gets to the police station. Again, they're already receiving reports. 2 officers go back with him to the site. There, the craft is gone, unfortunately. But in the middle of the road, they see this weird oil-like substance. One of the officers wrote in his report that it was the weirdest thing he had ever encountered in his entire law enforcement career. And it must have been truly weird because they didn't take a photo of it. They didn't take a sample of it. They simply said, this is weird. Let's leave it here and go about our day, which they did. Some believe that it was evidence of extraterrestrial beings. Others believe it was nothing more than a giant hoax. I'll leave it up to you to head to Long Prairie and decide for yourself. But the young man wasn't alone in his bizarre encounter. In 1984, 2 truck drivers, a husband and wife team from out west, were making their way to Madison, Wisconsin. As soon as they left, they were surrounded by weird balls of light. They said that it would follow them no matter how fast they went. And when they slowed down, the lights would just wait for them. By the time they reached Minnesota, these lights had turned into small, prehistoric bird-looking creatures that were now attacking their vehicle. So by the time the truck drivers pulled into Sauk Center to the Truckers Inn, they were terrified. They went screaming inside the cafe, talking about aliens attacking their vehicle. Well, of course, this got the attention of the local police, along with the young newspaper reporter. She was the first one on the scene. Together, they all went out to the car and they noticed that the rig, which had been freshly painted out west, now had little pop marks all over it as though something was throwing rocks against it. Or maybe mysterious prehistoric birds were tapping into it. Regardless, the truck drivers were so terrified, they refused to drive any farther. In fact, they had to send in another driver to take the route over. The truck driving couple grabbed a hotel room in town, but their terror didn't stop there. They claimed that these birds were now attacking them in their hotel as well. The next day, they checked out and drove in a car behind their rig that had a new driver. The good news is, or maybe the bad news, I don't know your macabre sense of adventure, but if you want, that hotel's still there, America's best value inn now. Unfortunately, we don't know what room they were attacked by aliens in. So my advice, if you're going to stay there, every night pick a new room, thereby increasing your chances of being attacked by these mysterious aliens. But as I'm running low on time, here's what I hope you take from today's program. If you open up your newspaper or you turn on the television news or listen to NPR, or God forbid you consult the internet, you'll probably say something similar to this. The world has gone crazy. Can you believe how crazy the world is today? And I agree with you. The world is completely bonkers today. But what I hope this program illustrates is that the world was crazy 100 years ago as well. It will probably be crazy 100 years from now when they look back at us and wonder what the heck we were doing. So that's what I hope you take from this program. And if you want more information, my website, Chad Lewis Research, has more than you could ever want or need. But I hope your adventure doesn't end here tonight with the program. grab one of my books, go on your own adventure of Minnesota. And when you do, I think you'll discover that you live in one heck of a weird state. And I mean that in a good way. You're going to see things you've never seen. You'll meet some odd people. And along the way, you might just discover that the scariest thing out there is often yourself. So with that, I want to thank the library again. It's very rare you can come to a program like this at no cost, check out a wealth of information. So if you like programs like this, let them know so you get more of these. If you didn't like this program, let them know so you get fewer of these. But either way, they should be applauded because I cannot think of a time in U.S. history in which the library has served a more important role than it does today. With everything going on with politics, the pandemic, societal issues, the library is the fabric that keeps our community together, a real treasure for anyone who has one. So to show my appreciation, if you're looking to get any of my books on my website, just type in the coupon code library. You'll get 20% off everything just because the library is so amazing. So with that, I'm going to stop sharing my screen. I'll turn it over to the library. If you have any questions or comments, either feel free to put them in the chat room or unmute yourself if you want to ask it as well. And thank you again for all of you showing up this evening.
All right. Thanks so much, Chad. That was a lot of fun. It was great. As Chad mentioned, go ahead and you can put your questions into chat. We did have one question in our registration forms, which was, do you know of any weird things specifically relative to Brown County or New Ulm?
Well, yeah, New Ulm, of course, I get a lot of reports about hauntings at the brewery there, which makes sense. Like many breweries around the country, it seems like some of the old brewers love to be there even after death. And it makes sense when you think years past, brewery workers would drink all day on the job. That would be part of their job, is they would just drink all the time, unlimited, as much as they wanted to. I come from Eau Claire, Wisconsin, and we had Walter's Brewery there. And that tradition continued on even to the point when they were driving forklifts in the warehouse and the brewery. People were still drinking, and then they just take home a case a week or whatever it was. So for a lot of these spirits that might be haunting the old shelved brewery there, perhaps they loved it and they refused to leave even from the grave. And then of course you have over a little bit west of where you guys are, all the Laura Ingalls Wilder stuff, and a lot of the sites, not only in Walnut Grove, but in South Dakota, in Iowa, and Wisconsin, have a haunted twist to them, dealing with Laura Ingalls Wilder and her mom and dad. In fact, Laura Ingalls Wilder claimed to the Missouri Ruralist magazine, she gave an interview stating that she grew up within 4 miles of the legend haunted Lake Pepin. So she was either familiar with the lake monster story or maybe Princess Winona that's thought to haunt the lake, and several others. So there's a lot in the area of just, if you're ever bored, whether it's a rainy day or maybe a pandemic, I recommend you look through the old newspapers of your town. You'll be amazed at how many odd stories you find, but also you really start to get a sense of the people and the places, because you start to see the same businesses advertising and talking about events in town. So it's a lot of fun. Just dig back 100 years into the town and see how much is different.
That's great. We had a question here. It says, what about Mary Tweeney?
Yeah, well, Mary Jane is a little different than Mary Tweeney. Mary Jane's the one I talked about, the alleged witch. And even though she was not killed, she died of a disease. Mary Tweeney was thought to have been buried, and maybe buried alive, was the story that people would hear around her grave. They would hear things like, help me, dig me up, save me. And at one time there was a a fence around the grave. I had never made it there. And as far as I know, the fence was ripped out and no one knows where the grave is any longer. So if anyone knows where it is, I would love to see it. That's one place I have not been to, because every place that I like to write about or talk about, I like to visit for myself to see what was going on or just get a feel of it. But her grave is one I have not been able to find. And over in Lamberton area, you have a haunted cemetery where people hear the same thing of "help me, dig me up, I'm alive down here." So a lot of weird stuff going on in the area. And that would be the Lamberton Sanborn Cemetery. I think you're muted now.
Okay, yeah, it says they moved her up north somewhere.
Yeah, that wouldn't surprise me. Unfortunately, a lot of graves or cemeteries that have a infamous reputation often suffer vandalism and just disrespect and litter and the like. So yeah, that wouldn't surprise me. A lot of places found amazingly that if they put up a sign saying, "This is the legend, we don't believe it, but you're welcome to be here and check it out, just be respectful," that has a huge impact on the amount of people that are being respectful there. Just that sign recognizing the legend, even if you don't believe it, but just putting it there.
Okay. Whoa. Helped move her head back?
Oh,
Okay.
Mary's? Yeah. Who knows? Yeah, I've heard people who said they were there or their parents were there at one time, and that but it's one of those
headstone. Headstone. Okay.
Very strange. Yeah, and people have removed headstones of infamous places too, because here in Wisconsin, we had Ed Gein's headstone taken many times. And if you've never heard of Ed Gein, do not Google him. You're going to be cursing my name if you do. But eventually they just left it blank. They did not put a new headstone there because people kept stealing it.
Yep. Okay. Do you have any other questions or comments? Okay. All right. Well, thanks again, Chad, so much for joining us here at the library. And as Chad mentioned, come into the library. We'd love to have you. And if you enjoyed this program, let us know. We'd love to have Chad come back another time and present one of his other programs or other authors and researchers, explorers, lots of great people. This program has been recorded, and so we'll be able to post it on our YouTube channel within the next couple of weeks here. So you can share it with friends and family as well, and check out Chad's website. I believe we have at least one or two of your books as well.
Yes, I believe so.
Mm-hmm. So you can come and check those out from the library too. But thanks everyone for joining us, and we hope you have a great night, and we'll see you next time.